Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining our JCU webinar series. My name is Stephen Boyle, and I'll be your MC for this evening's webinar. As the Dean of the College of Business Law and Governance, it gives me great pleasure to host this evening's webinar and to introduce one of our key researchers in Dr. Rachel Hay. But before we continue, I wish to acknowledge the Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first inhabitants of this country and pay my respects to the traditional owners and elders past, present and emerging of the land on which we stand today. In the spirit of reconciliation, I also acknowledge the valuable contributions that Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples continue to make to James Cook University and the broader community. Now, this webinar is the latest in a series where we invite our top researchers and academics to share their expertise with the local community outside of the lecture theatre. And today, JCU's Dr. Rachel Hay will be presenting Adopting Technology, How Women Play a Critical Role in Agriculture. But before that, just a little bit of housekeeping. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the Q&A box in your Zoom control panel. I will be monitoring this function throughout the presentation and will raise your questions when appropriate. So I'd like to now introduce Dr. Rachel Hay, our presenter this evening. Rachel is a social scientist and early career researcher teaching into marketing for the College of Business Law and Governance here at JCU in Townsville. Rachel's PhD research focused on technology adoption by women in agriculture. Her research extends to transdisciplinary approaches to sustained behaviour change in social marketing, technology adoption, and environmental protection interventions. Projects around changing behaviour include the adoption of technology in rural, regional, and remote areas, reducing sediment and nutrient runoff in sugarcane farming and grazing, and the Digital Homestead Project. So now I'd like to hand over and please welcome Dr. Rachel Hay.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Can you just check that you can hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you very well. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So thank you very much for the introduction. I'm very pleased to be here today with everybody. As we head into an era of agriculture where adopting tech will be critical in creating agricultural management efficiencies, we need to think really heavily about increasing our adoption of on-farm technology and in order to help manage livestock, crops and horticulture to help boost productivity. So while my research is mostly in beef, we really need to adopt on-farm technology across all areas of agriculture to meet demands for food security in the coming years. So I'm often asked when I do my presentations why we think that women don't do work on farms. Well, it's not really the case. What we're thinking about is, there's lots of technology out there, so why isn't it being used? So while men are adopting technology faster than ever before, it's still women who are primarily responsible for the purchase and installation and maintenance of those adopted technologies. So while we're playing a larger role in decision-making in agriculture or agribusiness, managing technology still creates that extra responsibility for women who are farming. So today I'm going to talk a little bit more about my research. So it's really digs deep into digital connectivity in rural, regional, remote Australia. And I first became involved in this topic in around 2014 when I looked at technology adoption in the beef industry in rural, regional, remote Australia. So as I said before, we knew at the time there was lots of rural technology on the market that was not being used by the beef industry. And we wanted to know why that was. So we knew men were not using it. So we went about investigating who was using it. And we had an inkling that it was women. So we used this as our investigative hunch. So just briefly on the 2014 study, which is the baseline study, it showed that rural women were using technologies roughly about 3 times more than men were. And that technology was being used both at a practical level for accounting and national livestock identification tracking, feed management, weather tracking, and also at a personal level. So communicating with friends and family and keeping up with news and events. So we also found that women viewed the role as using technology as valuable and important to the business and to the family. And we also identified that rural women found using technology empowering, self-fulfilling, and personally valuable. So women adopting livestock management technology quite readily. In turn, they're finding more value in profits, so selling cattle prior to sales. So I have a classic story involved with that one. When I was speaking to one of the people that were being interviewed, she said, I really had trouble we were at an ag show, and she said, I really had trouble deciding which bulls to bring to the show because I can only fit 3 on my truck, and I had 4 I wanted to sell. And so I talked to my neighbour, and she said, send me a photo on Facebook, and she shared that photo, and next minute I knew I'd sold 2 bulls, and then I had to find another one to put on the truck. So and she said she made more money in that day that she'd ever made at any sale. So she was really keen to keep using Facebook in that case as her platform to sell her cows. And there's also more value in productivity. So, for example, transferring data straight from a computer or from an ear tag, so wand, for example, straight to an Excel spreadsheet rather than having to write it all down and then come back and enter it manually. So we found quite importantly that the men behind these women were strongly encouraging them and very supportive of their views around technology. So now we know that women are heavily involved in using technology and that they're both drivers and decision makers when it comes to purchasing and using the technology. It's really exciting stuff, but the next set of data, we really wanted to know how women were engaging with it and how it helped them with their families in their rural settings, families and businesses in their rural settings. But before we go any further, we should have a little historical look at the history of women and men and how technology evolved. So around the era of the household revolution, using technology in the form of household goods was the work of women, and therefore not used or not viewed as a job for men. So when the literature discusses technology and gender division, it's often associated with heavy machinery and women being less able to use the machinery than men. And the literature also discusses that gender division in terms of women's use of technology is threatening men's masculinity. And it suggests that male farmers use agricultural technology to reinforce those patriarchal views or ideologies that the man is the farmer and the woman is the farmer's wife. And that therefore then marginalised and excluded women from farming. So with much of the household technology related to advertising or related advertising directed towards women, the household revolution might shed some light on the gender divide that is often associated with technology by authors such as Bock and Bryant and Pinney, Dawson, Morris, Gasson and Winter, and Kelly and Shortall. So they're all the people that write academically around, the gender divide. But if we're looking at historical writing around why women adopt technology, there's very little information around. And there's certainly nothing that I could find at the time about how women approached the adoption of technology. It just simply states that technology was adopted because it made life easier. So we know it's more than that, but there's not really any writing around that. So some of the literature discusses male and female roles in purchase decisions, so such as males being the dominant purchaser of brown goods, which I find hysterical. So brown goods are goods that are for the home but not for housework, and females being the decision makers for purchases of white goods. So those are the goods that are used for housework. But the literature doesn't really discuss the drivers of those decisions. So if we dig a bit deeper into the academic literature, the research says that in gender issues, Bryant, Pinney and Little were the main offenders in terms of researching surrounding women's role in agriculture. Rural geographers have studied gender issues in agriculture since around the 1980s, and the early literature highlights that women worked as hard as men, but their efforts were seen to be invisible. So there's a lot being done around invisible farmers at the moment, or in the past maybe 3 years, 2 to 3 years. And in fact, the Museum of Victoria commissioned a really large study to look specifically at women's invisible roles in agriculture. So if you Google that, it's actually really interesting because they use blog posts and personal stories about women's roles. So it's quite interesting. So in addition to that, women tended to marry into the farming family, and as such, men were regarded as the owners of capital and hence the owners of decision making. So until recently, women's work, which is characteristically secretarial, feeding the farm workers, caring for house animals and providing emergency labour, was not really regarded as an important role in the rural business. So by downplaying the gender difference, the essential role of women in economic profitability and therefore the viability of the farm was essentially ignored. So that literature is dated around 2009. No one's updated that yet. So this is the aim of this study, is to try and bring a little bit more currency to how women are viewed and how they work in agriculture. So a little bit more recently, the literature is starting to recognise women as having important diverse roles in rural business, and that traditional notions of patriarchal farm management might be declining. However, much of the literature still subordinates women in favour of men, which means that women are often overlooked as community leaders, decision makers, and by government policy in favour of men. So although current observations, as I said before, recognise that this is changing as time comes on. So rural women that I spoke to during this study don't recognise a gender division in agricultural farming, which I find quite interesting. After many conversations, it really became clear that rural women and men felt that there was very little gender divide, especially in the Australian beef industry, and that women saw themselves on very much being on a level playing field with men. So one of the quotes from the research said it's about being together. Men and women on farms don't see themselves as having gender-based roles, but as the job getting done by whomever is available when they are available to do it. This view has started to gain some momentum, and a writer or author, Beach, in 2013 stated that while the discourses of family farm and masculinization do occur, neither is the primary discourse expressed by farmers. So what she's saying is that she's agreeing with what the farmer that I spoke to at the in the study was saying. Whoever's around to do it can do it, and neither is dedicated to one job or the other. But this opinion did not extend to the use of technology, where in our 2014 study, we found that women were much more open to using technology, and men did not think that they could learn or use technology. Therefore, in most responses, technology-related jobs were only completed by women. So this is what spurred me on to continue looking at why women were the primary users of technology. So when I was talking to some of the men in the first round of data collection, I was really surprised to hear how sincere they were when they thought that they couldn't use technology at all, and that they just couldn't fathom in their heads that they could learn how to use it at all. Which was just totally surprising, because men in the city, they use technology all the time. So there was a bit of a disconnect there between the rural side and the city side. And about 2015-ish or 16, whichever beef was around that year, I went there and I spoke to a fellow who had come up from South Australia, and and he was telling me a story about how he, and I shared this story recently at Beef Week as well, but how he couldn't leave his farm. It was the first time in 25 years he left his farm because he had finally learned how to use a smartphone, and on that smartphone was an app where he could watch his water. And when the water went down at 50,000 litres one night, he got his neighbour to go and check, and he was able to go and fix the tank. And so he felt quite safe and secure in having that phone there to check on his farm. But when I asked him and dug a bit deeper, he didn't know what an app was. He didn't understand how that app got on his phone. He didn't buy his phone. He didn't program his phone. He didn't put the phone numbers in it. And all he knew how to do was press that button and answer a phone call. So while he was starting to really change, the smartphone really started to change how men use the technology. So I said to him, do you realize that's a computer in your hand? And he was like, it's not a computer. And it's like, it is a computer. I caught up with him recently, and he's now using a computer, which he never thought he could do. So it's quite interesting to hear that state of mind from the men around technology use in the bush. Completely changed now. Everyone I know is on board, and I totally blame the smartphone for that. So, and there's a study, another PhD just in that, I think. So I decided I needed to repeat my study to see what had changed in 3 years. So in the first round, 138 people responded to the survey. We had a small amount of men, but quite funnily, the women actually answered the men's questions. So men actually didn't do the survey because they didn't have to use a computer, which I thought was quite humorous. In the second round, 200 people responded to the survey, and 8.5% were men and 91% were women. So despite the survey being open to both male and female respondents, the men still did not participate as highly as the women did. So over both years, the men were aged 18 to 35 or over 36, and the women were, majority of the men were over 36 years old. And in both cases, in both years.
Rachel, sorry, can I just jump in? Sorry. There's just a question on the Q&A around the confidence of men and whether there's a correlation with education levels, suggesting previous studies have found on average women have higher levels of formal education than their partners. So I don't know if that was formed part of what you did.
I didn't look at education levels in this particular study, but I have in others. I didn't look deeply enough to answer that, but my gut feeling and my intuition was it was not based on education level, but confidence might have played a part. I think it was more about the unknown unknowns. I don't know what a computer is, so I don't know how to use it, and I don't know whether I can use it because I don't know what it is. So it was that whole unknown unknowns. But no, I didn't really look deeply into that data. Cool. So we use face-to-face interviews and online surveys and focus groups, and this is the data from the online surveys. So when we looked at the importance of rural women using technology, the first round was about gaining skills, which was the most important factor. So, and in the second round, having control of accounting or cattle management software, then skills, then the feeling of achievement, but especially that it was empowering was the results. The respondents were asked to answer strongly agree or strongly disagree to the question, how has adopting technology affected you? And we cross-tabulated the data between how you were affected, whether you were male or female, and that showed that only females answered the question in that data. So this is based solely on the females' responses. So we did a means analysis to determine if there was any change between the years on how technology was affecting the participants. So in the first round, women strongly agreed that gaining more skills from technology was the most important aspect of having technology. But in the second round, they more so agreed that having control over the accounting or cattle programs was more important, which goes towards establishing the importance of being able to use those skills in their business rather than just in that social life, which was originally the findings. So gaining new skills in the second round was strongly agreed as the next important, followed by technology giving respondents a feeling of achievement. And the respondents strongly agreed that learning how to use technology is empowering and that it improved their self-worth. So the mean score for I'd rather see someone else do it indicates a disagreement with the statement. So they'd still like to be responsible for their technology use on their property, even though they didn't want to be. So next we looked at how technology had changed their lifestyle, and the majority of women agreed that it saved time by not having to travel down to town to pay bills. It increased communication, and that technology was keeping them more involved in production practices, as well as removing the feeling of isolation. So on the other hand, though, and quite negatively, technology increased women's workload, and that was taking them away from outside duties that they really enjoyed. And this was quite well supported in their comments, in the anecdotal comments that came in the interviews, that, you know, they said, you know, they have to do it, they're in the house, but when they want to go out of the house, they still have to stay inside and do the work on the computer. So they didn't really enjoy that part of that increased workload, and that, I guess, limiting what their ability to do things. So we did a chi-squares test for independence to see if there was any significant change between the years. And that the most significant change between the years was that they felt less isolated. And so the second and third part of this study went into well-being and succession. So if I compared that reduced feeling of isolation with the well-being questions, you could see that that was a really important part of maintaining mental health in the farming family, and having a good level of mental health enabled them to do their business better. So it was quite interesting to check that data off with the other side. So there was also a significant difference in the statement. So it, or technology, has improved my communication with friends and neighbours, which also shows that agreement with that reduced feeling of isolation from the wellbeing side of the study. So the next question asked whose decision it was to bring technology onto the property. So in the first round, the dominant answer to the question was that decisions were made either together or predominantly by the woman that was on the property. By the second round, the spread of the decision making was almost equal and meant to joint decisions. So men and women were making the decisions together, or women were making the decisions about bringing technology onto the property. However, men did seem to be making decisions a little bit more about technology coming onto the property. So previously on, I spoke to my reference group is a bunch of farming women that I know, grazier women that I know, and I would go and test this data with them and say, hey, you know, why is it that men before, you know, in the first round of the study, men were not making decisions about buying technology, and why is it now? And they'd simply say that, you know, before they wouldn't even bother to look, or they didn't have their smartphone, or they didn't have access to something, so they just had to come to me and ask me because I was the one who used the computer. But now that they've got their smartphone and they can do some Googling on their phones, they're starting to find products or talk to over the fence to their neighbours, or at a field day to someone about some form of technology. And they're sort of starting to do a little bit of information seeking on their own. But ultimately, once they've made a decision, the decision still comes back to the woman in the household to then go and find the product, price the product, negotiate a price, organise the transport, and all of the other things that come with getting that product then to the farm, setting it up, teaching the men how to use it, and everything else that comes with purchasing technology for the farm. So while the men were still were having more input into the decisions, the women were still having to follow that up. So the other increase there was external decision makers increased in the second round compared to the first round. And external decision makers are typically the government, or it might have been, typically their accountant, or it might have been the government or a program developer or something to do with school that might have made them to adopt something else from that external decision.
Just one more quick question.
Sure.
You sort of male or female, were there any that did not identify as a gender?
No, there was none that didn't identify. So I did have an other, and everyone identified as either male or female. We didn't have a prefer not to say back then, but I do like that one now. I would rather use that than other now. So the usefulness of technology on the property. So participants responded that it had streamlined their farming systems, more so in the second round compared to the first round. In the second round also, they more so agreed that it had helped increase productivity on their farm. So Lawrence and Lago, Tay and Brindle, Obert and Block are all authors that support this, the decisions around adopting technology because of its usefulness. So especially in the technology adoption model, people will adopt technology if it's useful. Okay, so if it's useful and they adopt it, then of course it will increase their productivity. So that's kind of the theory behind that, loose theory behind that model. 79% in the second round of data collection said that having internet access on the property means that workers, including adult children, were happier on the property and meant that they would likely stay longer or return to the property. And again, this links in nicely to the wellbeing data that is the second part of this study that says that farms that have high connectivity are more attractive to farmers, to workers and children than obviously properties that don't. It's intuitive that that's meaningful, but when we're talking about employability and making your farm attractive as an employment option, these are the sort of things that we assume that people know, but they might not know, and so we need to make sure that this is clear, that this sort of connectivity is available on farm, so then you become a more attractive option than your neighbour who might not have that connectivity. And having connectivity and having workers available is extremely important to Australian farming and continuity of our to meet our goals. So nearly 60% of the second round respondents agreed that they are able to run the farm more efficiently because they have technology, and that of course supports the claims that technology can make things more efficient. Interesting. It's sometimes hard to reconcile that there's, quite a large percent, I can't remember the percent just off the top of my head, didn't really want to use technology, but they used it anyway. They felt like that the technology was forced on them, or that they felt like they had to do it. But there's an efficiency there in using it. So it's quite interesting if you cross-tabulate those people who didn't really want to adopt the technology but have anyway, and they don't really mind that they have but they didn't want to, are also stating that it makes their life more efficient. So that was quite curious in that data too. So we had some anecdotal comments or some open-ended questions around decision making, and respondents were able to tell us what they thought. So a couple of them said it helps us keep better connected in the industry, which makes us have better informed decisions, and it gives us better reporting tools. It helps us get up-to-date information. It allows us to compare prices when we buy products, and it allows us to make better decisions when we're managing our stock and breeding and selling cattle, for example. So also around GPS guidance for tractors and being able to send problems, photos to establish what sort of problems are there, remote tracking of breakdowns. So one of the really cool products that's around now is a piece of technology where on your body, and if you're riding around on a motorbike or a horse or whatever and you tip over, it will send an alarm back to the farm and give you GPS coordinates of where you are. So that sort of stuff's really important on remote properties. So changing roles, so technology means that we can do far more analysis and tracking and allows for faster turnaround of information and parts ordering, all sorts of things around systems and being able to have different types of operation in their daily business. Allows for, the second one cracks me up every time, allows for overeducated, underqualified university graduates, no offence to yourself, to think they know better how to care for our land and raise livestock crops than the fourth and fifth generation folk who keep their home and land in pristine condition and produce prime products. So she was really upset because at the time drones and things were new and they weren't being used as they are now, and so she was really upset that her privacy was being invaded. Another comment about changing roles was having things forced upon us because the local bank closed, so they had to go to online banking. Bills arrive late in the mail, or it's too late to pay by check, or cattle prices are emailed rather than phoned through now, so that makes life a bit hard. And whether they want to or not, they have to learn how to use the technology in order to keep up with the business. So they found that a bit hard to deal with in those changing roles. Another one was making life more frustrating, and this is more about connectivity. It's about the speed was really slow. We've changed a fair bit of that in the last few years. We work with a group called Better Internet for Rural, Regional, Remote Australia, and they've been advocating hard for people in the bush to have better connectivity, and I think we're starting to really kick some goals there. So while not everyone's connected and not everyone's happy yet, that's changed a lot. So it'd be interesting to run this survey again and see how much frustration's out there. So that one line response there is actually just a small demonstration of lots and lots of comments like that. Another one said it's helped big time, but it's left up to the female to make that big transition, and when it fails, you take the blame. Our connectivity is shocking, and this adds to my responsibility for the outcome. So some of these follow-ups to that is that someone will come in and use the computer or do something, and it's not working. Then the woman has to drop everything she's doing, come and make it work. That can sometimes take hours. One lady was saying in a case study in Burr that she waited 4 or 5 or 6 hours on the phone before she got an answer, or didn't get a call back at all, or whatever it is that didn't fix that connectivity. And all the while it's increasing stresses for the women who are having to deal with that. So that's where that negative feeling from adopting technology comes in. So the value of technology, in most cases, in both years, they enjoyed learning new skills, so found technology personally valuable. Knowing how to use and manage technology on the property makes women more valuable in the rural partnership. So that came through in both years. Being tech savvy gives me better standing in the community, more so in the second year or the second round of data than the first round of data. And they thought more so that using technology did allow for other jobs as they progressed through the adoption phase of learning new technology and adopting. As they adopted more, it got easier. So we thought we better check out what the men were thinking. We did this, we combined the men's views over the first and second round of data because we didn't have very many. There's a whole 19 there, so we can't put too much credence into it, but it's quite positive. So It talks about having skills and being more confident, and how technology is being empowered for the female in the partnership. It's helped maintain budgets. She's got more control over the business. Only like 47% in the first round said that they'd rather someone else do it, and 52%, still slightly more, said they still would rather someone else do it. So a couple of the quotes that came with that: by keeping up with technology, it allows us to make decisions on what technology will take up. It helps with joint decision making. My spouse and daughters are an incredibly valuable part of my team. Having access to technology to do the job and do it well is a bonus. Getting things done faster frees them up to spend more time doing things as a family. People really have no idea how important this is to people in remote Australia. I thought that quote was quite powerful as well. And shared knowledge and shared understanding makes for better business. So the men, so in the first round of study, only one of the men that I interviewed had a smartphone. By the next round, 3 years later, every single man that I interviewed had a smartphone. So when they were in the first round, they were quite in awe of the women in the partnership knowing how to do it. By the third year, they were still in awe, but they'd gained some power themselves about how to use it and what they wanted to get from it. So there was a nice change there in the attitudes of men doing more in technology space. Didn't take away from the women having to really work hard to make it happen though. So the overall results, women continue to be the main drivers of technology. They are responsible for all of the purchasing. They are responsible for setting up, troubleshooting, especially when it comes to connectivity. More recently, in the work that I've been doing, that's not part of this research, but it's just part of my everyday life. Men are really starting to get involved in having different types of technology on their farm, like drone technology, water sensing, gate and other security measures, walkover weighing systems, all sorts of things that they didn't think could be possible in the work that they were doing just a few years ago. So it's nice to see that thought process is changing. And I was talking to again my reference group of grazing women, and they're saying that the boys are starting to really get on board with the plug and play and just being a bit more proactive in that. So men are using technology more than they were previously. Problems with connectivity remain the largest barriers to adoption of rural digital technology and the Internet of Things. And women are still feeling frustrated with having to take on extra duties to do with those changing roles. But they are heavily influenced by having more control over the business, gaining new skills, having a feeling of achievement when using technology and learning how to use technology, being empowering and improving their self-worth. So we're not finished yet. I now have two lovely students working in this space. William is looking at understanding the relationship between connectivity and the adoption of technology in farming. So what we don't have is real data on how grazing people use, or grazing families use, internet connection. So Williams also owns his own internet provider. He's an internet provider, so we're able to use his data to really look deeply at how farmers are using the internet, and that's going to open up some real doors for adoption and distribution distribution of technology into rural areas. So One of the main problems is that it doesn't always connect to the products that are available in terms of connectivity, or it might not, it's not plug and play, it might be a different connector or whatever it is that is stopping them. So we're going to be able to look quite deeply into how they're using the internet. We're going to, William's going to do a survey and some face-to-face interviews on that. And then Carrie's looking at it from the small and medium enterprise side of things. She is looking at, we know that since connectivity has become better, that lots more women in particular are opening up online businesses in the bush from their farms. So Carrie's looking at, what does a small to medium enterprise look like in a grazing or in a rural area, and what are the influences on adoption and implementation of connectivity technology in order to have that business going, and then we're going to evaluate the impact of the on the effective use of internet connectivity and adoption. So those two are working really hard at the moment to continue this story, working also with Better Internet for Rural, Regional and Remote Australia, supporting the girls at that group by doing their data analysis, and we're moving more into, okay, well, we've kind of got connectivity sorted a little bit now, so now we need to work on supporting how people can use those, use their connectivity beyond the normal everyday stuff like answering emails and doing business and education and health. So it really into that ag tech adoption. Well, they're not totally focused on ag tech. I am totally focused on that. So yeah, so we've still got lots more to go. And I think I've finished a bit early, but I hope that gives you an insight into what I'm looking at and how I'm working in this space. And if anyone's interested in doing anything in that space or has some ideas or wants to talk to me about it, then you're more than welcome to give me a ring or an email and yeah, have a chat. If there's any other questions, we'd be happy to take them now.
Thanks, Rachel. There is one question in there about incorporating early use of technology, such as with the Royal Flying Doctor Service.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know whether, are you incorporating things like that, or?
No, we're not. So the next study really needs to broaden out quite a lot, because when we first started doing this study, there wasn't this thing called COVID that pushed us into other medical, like online medical appointments and telehealths and all of that. We were just really starting to get into having a consult with your doctor around a cancer treatment, and we didn't really look at technology in terms of tractors or GPS or monitors in sheds for piggeries or anything like that. We really just looked at the stuff that was being used in beef by producers for productivity. So even though Royal Flying Doctors, if you have an accident, you're not going to be very productive. So, but no, we didn't look into that side of things yet.
Okay. Well, I only had one question, but you haven't answered it, but you're going to be answering it, and it's how do we address the connectivity problem?
Yeah, so I'm actually talking to that at the Developing Northern Australia conference in August. So look, we worked together. We had great conversations with NBN and Telstra at Beef Week, and everyone is on the same team in trying to get connectivity to happen. The problem with Australia is that we have hills and bumps and space that doesn't make that very easy. We've got the can't think of the name, but the new satellite technology coming, and it's already having some issues with it has downtime for a few hours a day and that sort of thing. So yeah, one step at a time, one case study at a time. The government's just thrown a whole heap of money at it, which is fantastic. So there's going to be a lot more work. Telstra recognises that they're not moving fast enough, and they're keen to get people on board to join in with them to build some more infrastructure. And NBN are doing, lots of good things with having good connectivity almost everywhere.
Yeah, and somebody's just made a comment that also the level of service in this space also has implications for remote education and children living on isolated stations and things as well. So there's a lot more to this.
Yeah, so one of the very first things that Better Internet did was secure a free connection, like free data specifically for schools. So that came into play about maybe 5 or 6 years ago, and we're still working. The Isolated Parents and Children's Association works really strongly in that space as well to keep their connectivity going. And these are the two groups that I mostly work with when I want to distribute my surveys. So we kind of all work in really closely together. But education is certainly a very big motivator for people to get connected in the bush.
And there's one more question around, also saying thank you very much, one of the participants, but asking, in the surveys, did you sort of capture different regions? Were there different regions of the participants, or were they in different sectors? And if so, were there any differences between the different cohorts?
Yeah, so in the first survey, I only kept it to Queensland, basically west of Townsville, up to the tip of Australia. And then the second one, we made it Australia-wide. So we do have data on different areas of Australia in different sectors, but I have not had the time to analyse that yet. So anyone who would like to do a master's or an honours study, I have lots of data that needs analysing, so they can come on board and do that with me.
Thank you very much. That's fantastic. Yeah, very good. And just a quick comment there that it reminds one of the participants of a bit of the willing horse gets ridden the most. Yeah. If I had someone to do my admin, I'd feign helplessness too. Interesting comment, but yeah, so thank you, Rachel, and thanks everybody for attending, and for Rachel for presenting her research, which is fantastic. At the end of this webinar, there will be a link to a survey, and so we'd like people to stay on for a minute or two so that they can complete that particular survey, and that would be fantastic. This webinar has been recorded, and so the recording will be posted on the website, and everybody that has registered will get a link to that if they wish to overlook it again or pass on to other people to look at. Also, we're giving a shameless plug to the next webinar series, which is on the 26th of May at 7:30 p.m. with guest presenter Maggie Dent, and it's called Adolescence Unplugged. And if you want to register for this or any of the future webinars, you can visit jcu.edu.au/webinars, and you can register for upcoming webinars. You can watch previous recordings of webinars we've been running in the past and stay engaged with up-to-date research and activities, and also to stay engaged with us here at James Cook University. So thank you very much, Rachel. It's been fantastic. We've really enjoyed it, and I hope the participants have had a good time too. And we look forward to seeing you all again at the next webinar.
Thank you, everybody.